Yo, what's up, chefs? This is going to be the ultimate Dungeonborne Beginner guide, so whether it's your first time playing the game, or maybe you played it a little bit in the previous playtests and just want a refresher, then I promise this is the video for you. And by the end of it, you'll be leaps ahead of the average player, so sit back, grab some chips or your favorite snacky, and enjoy. First things first, when you open up the game, you should be prompted to create a character, where you'll have 8 classes to choose from that are locked to certain factions, which all have distinct skills and perks. Before we get into the classes though, let me explain the difference between the factions. The different factions to choose from are humans, which have extra inventory space that allows them to carry more items, undead, which have an extra resource called soul energy that is acquired by collecting souls from slain enemies, and this is what powers the respective classes' skills. And finally, we have the elves, which have the ability to go invisible and restore life while crouching and remaining stationary. Now for the classes, we'll start with the ones tied to the human race, and first up we have the fighter. This class has access to a large variety of weapons, is naturally tanky, a bit slow, and overall a powerhouse in melee combat. Its 2 skills are Whirlwind and Charge. Whirlwind is a channeled AoE spinning attack that can be used while moving. Charge is a short-range gap closer which allows you to get into melee range of your opponents more effectively. Next, we have the Priest, which has access to some melee weapons and some ranged magic weapons, is the only real healer in the game, and functions very well in group settings. Their 2 skills are Divine Guidance and Divine Protection, which use a secondary resource called mana to cast. Divine Guidance is a ranged AoE skill that deals damage to enemies and heals allies within its radius. Divine Protection is a shield that can be placed on allies or auto-targets yourself if there is no ally to target. The shield lasts for 3 seconds and makes you immune to damage. Following that, we have the Rogue, which has access to not that many weapons, but can use a crossbow, has high movement speed, high skill ceiling, and is quite fragile. Their 2 skills are Petrifying Poison and Vanish. Petrifying Poison makes your next successful attack turn the target to stone for a period of time. While they are petrified, they cannot take damage, and when they are attacked, the petrifying effect will go away. Vanish is relatively self-explanatory, but allows the rogue to go invisible for 15 seconds and gives them increased critical damage during the duration. The final human class is the Pyromancer. They have access to a few melee weapons, but primarily magic weapons, can do massive AoE damage, and is probably the most ranged focused class in the game. Their 2 skills are Pyroblast and Fireblast, which similarly to the Priest use mana as a secondary resource. Pyroblast is a 2-stage skill, meaning it can be charged up and does different things depending on the stage. Stage 1, aka an instacast, shoots out 3 homing projectiles that do medium damage on hit, and Stage 2 fires a large projectile that explodes on impact, doing a large amount of damage. Fireblast is a short-range fire shockwave essentially, that does damage, knocks enemies back, and applies a slow on hit. The next race is the Undead, and the first class is the Death Knight. They have access to a variety of melee weapons and the crossbow, are naturally tanky and slow, good sustained AoE damage, and a death grip. Their 2 skills are Soul Shroud and Grasp of the Grave. Soul Shroud is an AoE damaging effect centered on the player that moves with you as you do and uses souls as a secondary resource. Grasp of the Grave is a death grip type of ability that can be used on an enemy or an ally to move them and reposition them to the Death Knight. The other undead class is the Cryomancer. They have access to few melee weapons, but primarily magic weapons, similarly to the Pyromancer, have a massive amount of crowd control via their Ice Storm skill, have a self-immunity via their Frost Barrier skill, and are quite good in coordinated group play or even as a solo. Their 2 skills are Ice Storm and Frost Barrier as previously mentioned. Ice Storm creates a small vortex at the cursor's location, doing damage, and can then be moved around by clicking with your left click, not by holding left click to be specific, and after a brief period of time it will expand into a full-on storm, doing AoE damage and slowing targets. Frost Barrier is a personal use only medium duration immunity skill. You also regain life during this, and if your Ice Storm is already active, then casting Frost Barrier will not interrupt your Ice Storm. So you can use Ice Storm first on yourself and then cast Frost Barrier as an example. The final race is the Elves, and the first class is the Swordmaster. They have access to a couple of melee weapons and the crossbow, are relatively fast compared to the other classes, reasonably tanky, and use actual swords in your inventory as a resource. Their two skills are Psionic Blades and Whirling Blade. Psionic Blades conjures up to 4 swords total, which once fired will slightly home in on your target, doing damage on hit, and healing the Swordmaster for a slight amount with each hit as well. Whirling Blade summons a singular blade to orbit the player, doing damage to enemies around you. The final class is the Druid. This is the newest addition to the roster of classes and has access to few melee weapons and mainly focuses on magic weapons. Is relatively quick, is relatively fragile, and has a very high skill ceiling at first glance. They have more skills than the other classes, but not really. In human form, they have Primal Awakening, which turns you into a panther, and Force of Nature, which summons a treant at the cursor's location that does damage to nearby enemies and grants a shield to the druid when it hits enemies. While in panther form, they have an ability that reverts them to human form, and Force of Nature gets replaced by Shadow Assault, which allows you to leap forward, dealing shadow damage in an AoE upon impact. Now that you've decided what class you want to play, let's go over some of the main things you'll find in the lobby, starting with the merchants. First off, we'll talk about the Heirloom Merchant. This is where you can dismantle items of different rarities for different materials that are then used to craft heirlooms. Heirlooms are a new feature added to the game, but essentially these are items that can be upgraded and have their stats chosen specifically to fit your preferred playstyle. If you die in game with your heirlooms equipped, you can recraft them at the vendor for a minuscule fraction of what it costs to originally make them. This allows you to never really have to go into a game with a complete default kit equipped if you don't want to. Next up is the Alchemist. Rather self-explanatory, but at this vendor you have the ability to craft potions and bandages, special materials for upgrading your heirlooms, and finally throwable flasks such as the Thunderclap Flask that does damage in an AoE and slows all targets hit. All of these consumables will be covered later in the video as well. Finally, we have the actual merchant. This is where you'll sell all of your collectible items after each game, such as the horse statues and teacups that you might find. Beyond that, you can also buy different types of gear, although I wouldn't really recommend doing that here. And finally, you can purchase a plethora of consumable items, some of which are rather important, such as the Guild's Voucher, which allows you to auction items on the marketplace, and bolts for your crossbow. Following the merchants, we have the marketplace. There are two main sections, which are buyout trades and auction trades, that are then further broken down from there. Starting with the buyout trades and the purchase tab, this is where players have the option to buy all types of different items of different rarities. The important thing to note here is that whatever item you buy will have random modifiers rolled on it that will not be the same as what they were when the person listed the item for sale. Here's an example of me buying an item. Next, we have the Sell tab. This is where players can list items with a buyout price. Similarly to the Purchase tab, the important thing to note here is that the random modifiers do not matter. Whatever random modifiers you have on an item will be re-rolled once someone decides to purchase it. Listing items here usually results in a very quick sell, especially if you keep the price set at what the market recommends you. Here's an example of me listing an item for sale. On the opposite side, we have auction trades. Starting with the bid tab, this is where players have the ability to come scroll through items looking for something with the correct random modifiers for their build. And once they find it, they can place a bid on that item. The player with the highest standing bid at the expiration of the auction will win the item. The auction tab is the inverse of that, where players have the ability to create an auction for an item by setting a starting price, and then once it's listed, players can bid on the item until the time runs out, at which point the highest standing bid will be what the item sells for. You will also need a guild's voucher to be able to create an auction for an item, and those can be purchased from the merchant for 5,000 gold. With all of that in mind, the most important thing to understand here is that if you have a random item with mediocre stats, then you should probably sell it in the buyout trade section. And if you have a really good item with exceptional random modifiers, you should heavily consider selling it in the auction trade section. And the same thing applies for the type of items you are looking to purchase. Moving on from the different features of the lobby that will be important to you, let's hop into some of the core game mechanics that are worth learning in advance of your first game. Starting with what the game is all about, which is looting and extracting. As far as looting is concerned, there are a bunch of different ways to go about this, but here are some of the main things you should be looking out for. Number 1, you can loot items from enemies, whether it be players or PvE mobs. Number 2, you can loot chests scattered all throughout the different maps. And number 3, a slightly less obvious one, is that there are breakable crates and vases scattered around that typically have gold you can pick up as well. Also, just a quick tip, you can open a full-sized map in-game by pressing M. When it comes to extracting, the main method that will be used is finding what I like to call blue portals. These can be spotted via a blue glow emanating from the ground. These will start spawning as the match goes on and can be found almost anywhere from what I've seen. As you begin to open one, a pulsating effect will occur on the minimap that all players can see, which gives away your location. You can prevent this from occurring though by acquiring a ritual scroll prior to opening a portal if you'd like. In addition to that, it seems like there are static extraction points on some of the different maps as well that you can see here on my map. However, I have not personally tested these yet, so take that with a grain of salt, and you might want to check them out whenever you get the chance. I'll be streaming live today once this video goes up, and I'll make sure to test it then. Also, feel free to stop by the stream if you have any questions. I always strive to be super informative and interact with and answer as many questions from the chat as possible. Moving on to some basic combat mechanics, most weapons in this game will have some variation of a light attack, heavy attack, and block effect. In addition to that, some weapons have the ability to do a perfect block/parry, which is indicated by your weapon glowing white, which will then allow you to do a riposte attack immediately after for high damage. The important things to note here for PvP is that light attacks can be blocked or parried. Heavy attacks, however, will break through blocks, but can still be parried, and additionally, the charging process for heavy attacks will be interrupted upon taking damage. This creates sort of a rock, paper, scissors type of melee combat that I personally enjoy, where light attacks beat heavy attacks, blocking beats light attacks, and heavy attacks beat blocking. And perfect parries kind of beat everything in a sense. Oh, I guess it's like a health shrine or something? Oh my. Okay, that guy actually just got cooked. Our final section of the guide is going to cover consumables, which are actually very impactful in this game. We'll start off with the easy ones, which are health potions, bandages, and mana potions. Health potions will restore 10 life per second for 30 seconds, resulting in a total heal of 300 health, which is usually anywhere from 20 to 40% of your total HP pool, depending on your class choice, for perspective. Which means that having a health potion running during the entirety of your PvP fights is incredibly important and should not be overlooked. Bandages also restore 300 health, but have a use time of 6 seconds, making them the preferred method for healing after a fight or if you take damage from a mob. However, finding time to sneak a bandage in during a fight can easily sway fights as well. Mana potions are very similar to health potions, but they work for mana. These are incredibly useful on casters such as Pyromancer and Cryomancer. Following that, we have the Flasks that all share a 20-second cooldown with one another, which means that if you use one of them, you will have to wait 20 seconds before being able to use any of them again. Currently, there are 5 that exist, which are Incendiary, Thunderclap, Stone Shaping, Smokescreen, and Shielding. I'm not really going to touch on Stone Shaping and Smokescreen much, because I think they are going to be a bit more difficult to find value from, but that doesn't mean they're useless, and I'm sure as time goes on, we will start to see creative ways that people find to make them valuable. The main ones we are going to focus on though are Incendiary, Thunderclap, and Shielding. The Thunderclap Flask, which from my experience in the previous playtests and from my testing so far in this playtest, still seems to be one of the strongest. Once thrown, it will do 80 damage in an area of effect and apply a massive slow of 75% for 3 seconds, which is incredibly strong, especially for melee classes that are trying to close the gap on something like a Cryomancer or Rogue as an example. Next is the Incendiary Flask, which also does 80 damage but spread out over the course of 2.5 seconds via the fire it leaves on the ground. Currently, I think this flask is useful, but I would typically almost always prefer to have the instant 80 damage and slow from the Thunderclap Flask, and I think if the developers want to see the Incendiary Flask compete with the Thunderclap, they will need to buff it in some way by potentially increasing the damage, or they can just nerf the Thunderclap Flask, which might also be a good idea to be honest, because it's pretty strong. Finally, we have the Flask of Shielding, which has a long use time and provides a 250 damage shield that lasts for 15 seconds. I have done some testing with this, and it does seem strong, but it's kind of hard to find a place for it considering that it shares a cooldown with the Thunderclap Flask, which usually seems like a stronger option. However, I do think there is the potential to use a Flask of Shielding before a fight, and then try to take a short trade towards the end of its duration. Then, once the cooldown of your flasks is over, you can sneak in a Thunderclap Flask during the fight. I have a feeling that might end up being the proper way to make use of your flasks during fights once people get comfortable with it, but I've got to do some additional testing on it to see for sure. That is going to conclude the video though. I hope you guys enjoyed and were able to learn something new. I should be live streaming on YouTube once this video is posted, so feel free to stop by and ask me any questions you might still have, or just come say what's up. Other than that, if you have a spare moment, make sure to hit that sub button. And last but not least, take it easy, chefs.